Welcome back to Track D, AI and Machine Learning Summit. We're starting a new session on ensuring data privacy with Julia Komissarchik, who's going to be talking. She's the CEO and founder of Glendor, and she's going to be talking about how to do data privacy. As we think about what Paul said, you need more data to train your projects, but as you start training your projects, you start having more and more chance of impacting privacy. And Julia's in the process of addressing probably the biggest challenges around privacy. So, Julia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Let me start sharing my screen. Hi. So today we're going to talk about ensuring data privacy. And as I mentioned, my name is Julia Komissarchik. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Glendor. Oh yes, and I actually have a blinking first page. So let's start. And as Paul mentioned, once we have large amounts of data, there's a lot of very interesting things that can be done. But one of the biggest challenges is actually having access to that data. So big data in artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is data thirsty. Everybody knows that. And it requires a large amounts of data for training and testing, especially for training. And this is especially true for deep learning. It's true in general for machine learning, but especially true for deep learning. And being short on data, and I think lots of us went through this experience, it means that the models will be overfitted, which means that if they're too closely trained on a particular data set, and if it's presented with a new data set, the system will perform badly. So let me give you a model overfitting example, a real life model overfitting example. NIH, National Institute of Health, ran 2 competitions on PHI identification. And we'll talk about what I mean by PHI identification for medical texts in 2014 and 2016. It was a standard setup. You have certain training data that you provide to the teams. The teams train their models, their systems, and quite often it's more than one model. So systems would be a more appropriate description. And then the resulting systems are tested on a set of data. So in 2014 competition, the system was trained on 2014 data and tested on 2014 data. And the best performer demonstrated F1 of 0.9757, which is great. So now 2016 came about, and in the competition, what was done is the systems that were trained on 2014 were run on the 2016 testing data, and the results were 0.799, which is 10 times worse, right, than the original results. So that's an example of where if the system is not trained on all the variability of different real world situations, the results would be good on the known set, but will not be as good on the new set. So moral of the story, easy to overfit if you don't have enough data to represent the real world with all its diversity. By the way, if you have any questions, let me know, and we can ask them midway as well. We don't have to wait for the presentation to be over. So data availability. In some cases, area can be procured. Well, quite easily, or it's not that difficult to procure it. An example would be a few years ago, there was an advertisement auction log with millions of records that became available. And there were several research teams that did very interesting research in developing models based on the reinforced learning to create automatic auction agents. However, the situation is more difficult, for example, in the healthcare, because unlike financial health information, which changes as you go through life, health information stays with you forever. And as a result, it's even more sensitive than, let's say, credit reports and credit card information. So in 1996 in the US, there was a law, HIPAA, which was focusing on medical data. HIPAA stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. In 2016, the European Union passed the GDPR law, which actually covered a variety of data, not only health data. GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulations. Both of them put serious restrictions on data sharing and aggregation, and rightfully so, because the privacy must be preserved. But that creates a problem for developers, because how would we train our systems if we don't have access to the data, because it has personal information and that information needs to be protected. There are a couple of contingencies that are being used. For example, if there is no, if you don't get your first pick, you can look into the second and third bests, and there's a number of tricks that can be used. And it's not tricks, it's approaches. But one of them is, for example, synthetic data generation. If you have a good idea of what the data should look like for training, you can synthetically generate it. Or use real data and then modify it to create additional copies which are almost the same but slightly modified. That way you can create larger volumes of data. However, these approaches work only on tasks that are homogeneous, where you can actually predict what real world will look like. In many cases, and it is especially true for medicine, familiarity with real data samples is not sufficient to create a system that will generate synthetic data, right? And furthermore, and that's once again something which is well known in the industry, the way AI models devise their decision power is still opaque. There is work done that is being done to make it more transparent, but for now it's unclear how the system can react to small changes that humans easily gloss over. And we've all seen interesting examples, like the one I found particularly disturbing is when a system is trying to recognize animals in the picture, and you present it with a rose, it recognizes a bunch of eyes looking at you from every petal. Just one of those sci-fi horror movies type of images. So procuring data for training. Well, one of the methods is federated AI. If I don't have enough data and you don't have enough data, if we work together, we hopefully will have enough data to do this. An example from medicine would be, for example, rare disease, where even the largest hospital might not have enough data to train. So they have to cooperate with other hospitals throughout the country and throughout the world. So what do I mean by federated AI? It's several institutions collaborate together on a project. Each of them have some data, they can't share it because of the privacy concerns. So what they do is they agree to train the same model on different on the data sets, but what happens is that the model is trained locally, and then the values of the model are shared with other players. That way, no private data is shared, but the model parameters are shared. Okay. So, but the ultimate answer is to create systems that will be able to remove PII, and that's where we've discussed PHI identification. So let's talk about what is PII and PHI. PII is personally identifiable information. That would be, for example, the name of the person on the credit card, and PHI is protected health information. That's the private information that is located in health records. So that's the ultimate answer, how to remove that sensitive information. That way, the data can be shared and aggregated and used in various models, to train various models. So, there are quite a few different verticals that AI is working on. What we wanted to focus on is our vertical, which is healthcare. So big data, let's talk about examples. So big data and AI in healthcare. HIPAA and GDPR that we discussed previously put strong requirements on medical data sharing, and rightfully so. So these requirements include things like patient's name, physician's name, location, dates, patient's age, phone number of medical personnel, hospital name, etc. There's a certain list of items that that could not be shared. Also, one needs to consider voice recordings, faces that can be used in facial recognition, and even visible on X-rays implant parts numbers. If we've all seen some CSI movies, and we know that by the implant part number, one can identify the person. So if there is a failure to follow HIPAA and GDPR requirements, there are, of course, financial implications, there will be fines, legal implications, but most importantly, there will be reputation damage to the researchers and their institutions, because then patients would not be able to trust the hospital if they know that the information about them is shared, even for research, with others who are not necessarily, their doctors and nurses. So what should we do with PHI? Well, we need to remove it before sharing medical data. Or in that case, it's not only medical data, we need to remove private information before we can share any kind of data. There are three modes that are used to deal with PHI. One of them is reduction, meaning the information is deleted, it's just blacked out from the record. The other is de-identification, where the information, let's say it said that the record was for John Smith, and you change it to Frank Brown. Or if the date was 5/11 to 2021, we'll say it was 7/15/2061. That kind of identification. And anonymization, where the content is changed so that we can guarantee that this information, the private information, will never be restored. The third one, anonymization, is very rarely achievable because you might have some additional information. For example, if somebody has a very distinctive tattoo that will be visible in the medical image, even though you would remove their name and information about them, that tattoo would identify them. And that's just an example. So in most practical applications, everybody's focusing on the first two: how to redact, meaning remove, or de-identify, meaning replace. So a couple of examples that I wanted to show you from healthcare. Medical texts, medical images burnt ins, medical images metadata, engraved part numbers, etc. But the list goes on. There's videos, voice recordings, and others. So let me show you the first one, which is medical texts. I know it's hard to read, but you have to take my word for it. There are two items. One of them, it says that record date 2069-0407. Once again, it's already been de-identified. And Mr. Villegas is seen today, and then there's discussion about his treatment. The next one is, once again, record date such and such, and then what's the hospital name, what was the complaint, etc. This data is actually from that NIH test that I was discussing earlier. So that's the examples of text. In these cases, things like date and the name needs to be identified and either removed or replaced. Removed meaning redacted, or replaced meaning de-identified. So now let's take a look at the images, where it gets even more difficult, because for a lot of medical images, what happens is at the time the exam happened, at the time that image was created, the personal information was burnt into the image. So in this particular case, you'll see this is an X-ray, and then if you can see it in the right, it says account number, and then the number of the account, the date of the exam, then the name of the person, his age, and his date of birth. All of this should not be there, right? Or it either needs to be replaced or redacted. And it's one of the trickier problems. So another example, sometimes for medical images, there are formats like the one I showed before, which was a JPEG, but there are also so-called DICOMs. DICOMs are especially effective for studies where you have more than one image. So CT scan, ultrasound, MRI. That way you combine, it's easier to visualize it, so you can almost show it as a movie, but also it adds additional meta tags, those so-called DICOM meta tags. And you won't be able to see it, but it's quite a long list, and it has like patient name and patient date of birth and all of this. So not only the image itself will have private information, which in this case it will be right here, but also the meta tags will have private information, and both of them will need to be addressed before an image like that before a file like that can be shared for research. And then one more example. There are quite a few different ones. We're discussing the part numbers. So this is a pacemaker, right? So it's an image similar to the one which we started with, which was X-ray, chest X-ray. But what happens here is actually you can see the pacemaker on that chest X-ray. And if the light is right, or position is right, you can actually see all the numbers and dates that are engraved into the cover of that pacemaker. That's private information. That's something that needs to be removed for sure before images are shared. Otherwise, the image can be associated with this particular person. So now we know the problem. Let's discuss how we can address it. How do we redact de-identify PHI? Well, there are three methods: manual, template-based, and fully automatic. So manual is, what I mean by manual is you show to the radiologist an image and tell them, please tell me where exactly the personal information is at, and then that information is manually blacked out. This is definitely expensive, definitely non-scalable, and also, nobody's perfect. Humans also have 5% of error rate on average on a lot of different tasks. So template-based, what I mean by template-based, if I know for sure what kind of template was used or how the image was generated, and I know for sure that always the person's name will be in the top, well, I guess for you it will be in the top right corner, right here, then I can say, okay, I'm always going to black out that corner. This works fine if everything is uniform, which it never is. But let's say a technician decides to generate an image which will be slightly different, or the image that you are processing came from a different machine. Then the problem is that the template is no good, and you don't even know whether or not it missed something. For example, in DICOMs, quite often they not only include images, but they also include the sort of scan of your report. And that's where the automatic, semi-automatic template-based methods fail, because they don't distinguish between the two. So, well, what we are proponents of fully automatic, which is most effective and efficient method. But it's difficult to build. And the story of the NIH competition clearly demonstrates that. So how do we tackle this very difficult problem? Well, let's recap. So, and this is not necessarily just healthcare specific. It's true for any vertical where you have personal information. So the first one is deep learning needs a lot of data for training. Data contains private information. Private information must be de-identified. To do that at scale, one needs to build an automatic de-identification system. To build such a system, one needs to do it with private information. And we just went to the first one, right? So it's just like catch-22. In order for you to build, in order for you, for me, for anybody to build a PHI identification system, one has to have a lot of access to the data, but we can't have access to the data because it has PHI in it. So that's the challenge. And we believe we found a solution that worked for quite a few different applications for us in the past, and that's so-called hybrid approach, which is, as it sounds, it's a hybrid of multiple approaches. So the main principles are: divide the space into potentially overlapping regions, each of which demonstrating homogeneous behavior. Build individual oracles for each region. When available, use existing models. Sort of, if there is something you can leverage that has already been built by the community, then please go ahead and use it as much as possible. And then, if data exists in similar domains, build models to be used in transfer learning. Let me give you an example: name recognition. NER is a well-known problem, right? Which with several solutions, none of them is perfect, but it's getting us closer to the goal. So that would be an example of when available, use existing models. And then combine results of individual oracles on overlapping regions. That's the approach, and that helps us mimic actually what we as humans do, because we don't necessarily use one method for everything, right? We always leverage multiple signals, leverage multiple approaches. And then as time goes on, we get better and better at understanding what approach works for what better and what is reliable or not. Because it's critical when you choose oracles that you're using for any particular part of the space, that those particular tools are high precision. They might be medium recall because they're not working on everything in the space, but they have to be high precision. That way you can guarantee that together you can build a system which will be high precision and higher than medium recall. And that's my presentation. If you guys have any questions, please reach out to me during the conference and also afterwards. My email is julia@glendro.com. Thank you very much for the call.
Unmute, start video. Julia, thank you so much for that. That was a fascinating look into the challenges with private information and some approaches to solving that problem. Sorry, I'm not in my forward position. You talked about redaction, de-identification, and anonymization. And I am familiar with redaction. We have content that we have in my firm where I have to go through and redact content before we can use it. But on that de-identification task, don't you still end up with the ability to get back to the original data? Because you're not going to make everybody Joe Smith. You're not going to make everybody just 60 years ahead of where they actually had the time.
It's usually not only 60 years, but random, and that's the key. So there is no way to convert it back, unless there's certain cases where you need to keep track of it, right? For example, if I'm doing a study and there's an MRI and an X-ray working together, I need to know that this is from the same patient. I don't need to know the patient's name, but I do need to know that it comes from the same source. But in general, what one does is to do it random. It's sort of like a PGP, right? Mm-hmm. So it's harder to go back.
So you've created a random generator, but how do you know? Okay, so I mean, with some things it's obvious. Mm-hmm. It's a patient. We're going to have an MRI. We're going to have an X-ray. We're going to have a treatment plan. That all kind of needs to stay together. We can mm-hmm. anonymize the rest of it. But with other data types, I guess I just want to say it's not always clear. And is there what the factors are that are going to be the important aspects of the model that we're going to generate? So I'm challenging how I'm finding a challenge and how I would apply that to mm-hmm. to my problems, I guess. Sorry.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So there are a couple of things, right? If you're doing a model which is not PH identification, right, which is a can of worms that we're addressing, but if you're just looking at training a model on a data set, in a sense, the dates on that data set will not be important unless if they are, and that's where the medical studies come in, right? Because when it's a series of things, then you preserve the relative position. Let's say I have 5 X-rays, right, taken every 5 minutes. Then we'll need to preserve the relative position of those X-rays, but we don't need to know that it happened on 5/11 at 3 p.m. And that way you preserve information that is needed, at the same time protect the privacy. So in those particular cases, the de-identification needs to be specific or more specific to your use case.
So I have to have a good understanding of my use case so that I can make a good prediction of what are going to be the points that the model is going to hang off of so that I can keep them correlated.
Let me give you an example, and that's something that quite a few different companies did. So we're in the age of COVID X-rays, how to automatically distinguish between somebody with the COVID and somebody without the COVID. When you're training a model on this, you don't need to know who the names of the patients are. You might need to know their gender. You might need to know, you must know the information whether they do have COVID or don't have COVID. But the fact that they were John Smith or Joanne Smith, it doesn't matter to you because for your model, because what you're distinguishing is the images of the lungs rather than basing your conclusions on the person's name. And there are other use cases, but with this particular case, with the COVID X-ray distinction, you don't need all this information, but you do need to know whether the person had COVID. So if that explains, if that answers your question. But
it answers my question. I'm a contrarian, so I'm immediately coming up
good.
with counterpoints.
Excellent. Let's do them.
No, because they're not. I don't think they'll be interesting to the audience, to be
Okay.
honest. Again, but thinking back to Paul's model, and he had that he had that the model he designed at the end of his talk, where it was, we have a semantic search on one side, and on the other side we have sales transactions going back and forth, and we're gonna use the AI to come together. Some of the, you could argue that it's going to be related to the specific paragraphs that were sent back, or the specific language that was sent back, but it might also be related to the person, because it might turn out that that particular salesperson has a relationship with the person he's selling to, and so it became an easier sell than that same person in a different position without having that relationship. But how, you can do that through de-identification by keeping, instead of saying Ed Dale, you say Joe Dip, and keep that Joe Dip together, so that that those different, I don't know, I'm sorry, it's just I see this as a huge challenge of logic to build your models around. And you talked to some of the automation that can happen, but it felt like this is an example where we're at the coalface.
Well, in Paul's example, what he is dealing with is publicly facing data, which is a different story. So let's say, if I want to for example, company information, how they present themselves through various press releases and other information, that's something which is public. It's designed to be public. So it's a different story. When we're talking about, for example, health records, they were never meant to be public. So there, the treatment is different. But for example, for Paul's case, most of the information is already public. So the problem of aggregating data becomes an issue, but that's a different story. But as far as the privacy is concerned, it's less of a story. It depends, right? Like everything else, it depends on what we're talking about. If it's actually one-on-ones, customer conversations, then it's one thing. If it's press releases and other public-facing data, that's another thing. And then you have to mix and match. But you're raising a very good point, because you can't just raise everything. Because, for example, in the Paul's case, you need to know that this particular interaction came from the same salesperson. And that's where in de-identification, what you keep track of is whether it's the same ID. That way you can say, okay, these came from the same person, these came from different people. And if it's needed in your model. That's why de-identification and anonymization, it's actually also model specific. You can't just use a blank statement for everything, because different cases have different applications. Like that COVID lung test, you don't need to know the history. You're just doing a simple categorization. But for some other things, where, for example, you're looking for patient's history, there you have to protect. When it comes to healthcare, you have to protect the knowledge that this actually came from the same person, and this particular event happened before this particular event.
That makes sense.
So, well, as with everything, it depends, right? And the answer is tricky, but there are ways to go around it, and that's the good news, right? Because otherwise, let's say we can't do anything about it, then we're stuck. Because if, let's say, you're part of a large institution, you might have access to some data, but with rare diseases, that doesn't help. Because even if I'm one of the largest hospitals in the States, I still don't have enough examples to be used to train my system. I have to work with others and aggregate data and share data. And it's even worse for startups. There's so many different startups that are doing, for example, AI in medicine. And one of the biggest challenges for them is access to the data.
Yeah, and that leads to that federated AI solution that you talked to before. Question from the audience: with globalization in effect, are there any challenges that may be more complicated than others in ensuring data privacy, especially when we're considering diagnostic tests can be evaluated and transcribed in a completely different country at a completely different time frame, which is usually done to cut costs and reduce turnaround time, but that seems to create challenges around privacy.
But one of the interesting things which is happening is countries throughout the world are adopting HIPAA and GDPR. You can, I've read recently, Ecuador is considering new laws that will protect privacy. Other countries have already done it. So it becomes more and more cohesive as far as the privacy is concerned. But yes, that's one of the challenges where, for example, and then it becomes the question of how to protect data in transfer. So let's say you're working with a country somewhere else where it will be cheaper to transcribe the records. Then you might even want, you will have to do two things. One of them is protect the entity that is doing it, to make sure that they protect the PHI, but also to make sure that during the transfer, that information is not broken into.
Okay, that makes sense. But but you continue to have the same challenges with privacy as each country adopts their own rules, maybe based off of existing rules, but still probably with their own flavor to them.
Yeah. But we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, well, we all have the same challenges around trying to. I was talking to you offline about the fact that my privacy concerns take up 8 to 12 weeks of a 3-week project. It's just it's insane to me how large the privacy concerns are, and I think I'm going to be coming back to the lawyers with the concept of this is publicly available information. This is already disclosed information, and so it should be able to be processed. I'm trying to think of other questions that came up in my mind as we were talking through the presentation. I'm looking over at my notes here. We started to talk to the the hybrid approach with the automation that occurs, and I'll be honest, it felt like there was a step missing there. Was there more? Is there more that you'd like, or more that you could talk to about how that hybrid approach would work?
Well, the challenge which we're facing, we personally, because we need to work on the PHI identification, which means we need data with PHI, which is not available to us because it has to be protected. So that's why we use methodologies that are requiring less data. For example, by leveraging tools already developed for other verticals or other models, like I mentioned, NAR. Also by being able to sort of divide the space, divide and conquer, right? You divide in space into more homogeneous parts rather than training your model and having just one single model that you train on everything under the sun, which doesn't work. What you do is you find cohesive pieces and you train only on those cohesive pieces. And because they're cohesive, there are a couple of things which is happening. First of all, you can actually use all those tricks that I discussed, like synthetic data or taking real data and modifying it so that you have multiple examples. So, but it's yeah. And by the way, I keep using NAR. I need to be very specific. It's name entity recognition, right? Like, which is a problem for a lot of different tasks, not only for de-identification. How do I define that this is John Smith? And if the name is, for example, more complicated or unusual, how do I know that this is still a person's name? And you get it from the context, you get it from, that's another discussion altogether, but I'm sure that a lot of people already have experience with it. But basically what you're doing is you're leveraging as much as possible everything that you have available. And then you sort of need to be very careful how you choose how do you choose your tools and which tools you apply to which areas. Because as I mentioned, in order for the system to be reliable, each particular tool has to be high precision. But it will be medium recall by construction because you're focusing on a small subset of the space. And then you sort of divide the space, might be overlapping, then you build tools for each of those spaces, and then you combine them. And then you have to make a decision. If you have multiple tools and they disagree, what do you do with that? So every single step of this, in a sense, is something which has been done before. The question is, how do you combine it? And that's where it becomes more of an art rather than, a step-by-step recipe book. Or
Another question came in from the audience. With regard to AI and its integration into medicine, are there any concerns with regard to cultural nuance or implicit bias? Any thoughts on how to address those sorts of
that's one of the
questions?
problems, right? Because you want to have as diverse data as possible. Diverse from so many, diversity is has so many different aspects. So you need to have as diverse data as possible. And that's one of the things which we're hoping to address. By doing PHI identification, we allow for the data sets to be much less homogeneous. So yes, in a sense, but it's, it's on the path in that direction.
Yeah, mainly
That's
through,
one of the ultimate goals.
mainly through data diversity and
Yep.
keeping heterogeneous content or heterogeneous data.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that your de-identification raised in my mind was gender and the connection between gender. We always hear about that with medicine. So
And also the fact that somebody has different backgrounds, right? Because So, but that's the goal, right? Because the more no single data set can represent the real world, but the more data sets we have and researchers have access to it, the better our chances that we can develop solutions that will work for real world and not just a small subset.
yeah, that's the challenge, to be able to keep it from just being an ivory tower solution, right?
Yeah.
I'm just going to give everyone a chance here for another set of questions. See if anything comes in.
Well, I will be available at the chat room after the presentation. So if you have any questions, please reach out. And also you have my email address. So once again, if you have any questions, please reach out to me and let's talk.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I took a lot away from this one in particular because it is a challenge I'm facing directly. Okay, so just a reminder to everyone, we'll chat room, as Julia mentioned, she'll be there to answer questions. We're next session here in Track D, AI and Machine Learning Summit, will be using AI for digital document accessibility compliance with Ian Smith. We will reconvene at 4 o'clock, and I will talk to you then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Julia. Appreciate it.
Bye.
That was awesome.